Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Now, the mind is a powerful tool. We have all heard of this, especially in the context of when an individual is able to overcome an impossible situation. But do we really understand the true capacity of the human mind? Today, we discuss how exactly can we control our lives for the better and how the human mind can be used to transform one's life. Joining us for this discussion, our esteemed guest. We have with us first Dr. Ali Jawaid, who is a physician, scientist, a medical doctor and a neuroscientist, and who is currently working at the Brain Research Institute in Switzerland. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ali. Dr. Ali, let's begin with you.
Sure.
How exactly powerful is the mind?
Right. So I'll begin by saying that, like a long time ago, there was a big distinction between what's the brain and what's the mind. And as the neuroscience has advanced, we now know that brain and mind, they are just two names of the same thing. Everything has an organic basis. Our behaviors, whatever input we take, how we communicate, it's all controlled by our brain. And then the manifestation we get is basically as the mind.
Okay.
Now, there are different periods of sensitivity during which the brain is very dynamic. It's very plastic.
What do you mean by dynamic here?
Yeah, so what I mean is that it's a very plastic organ. So there are circuits in the brain which are very malleable. Every input we have, every experience we have, whether it's a factual experience, whether it's an emotional experience, that leaves its footprint. And the most important thing is that the footprint, the signature, it's not only present in the brain, but actually brain communicates with every organ in the body.
So, Dr. Ali, what you're alluding to is, of course, a very complex working of the brain. So, do normal people actually understand the potential the brain holds?
I would say that, we have like a subconscious understanding of how it works, but a lot of us are not able to actually tap into it. And if you look at the prevalence of mental health disorders, actually a lot of us are losing our capacity to actually modulate our mind because of certain illnesses, because of certain life experiences. But actually brain, it's a very powerful organ. And through let's say a positive attitude, we can even control the manifestations of other diseases which affect the other body systems. For example, you must have heard of the placebo effect,
yes.
Right? Now the effect is coming all from the brain. It's just the attitude which we encode through our brain, and then it modulates the immune system, all the different homeostatic functions in the body.
So the placebo effect being when you think that you've taken a medication or any substance that is actually impacting the physiological state, but it is not, but it is a trick of the mind.
It is a trick of the mind, absolutely. Or you could say that it's actually positive neuropsychology. It's like we believe in the effect of it, and then we modulate our immune system and our different body functions and homeostasis in a way that it becomes effective.
So, Dr. Ali, you mentioned here right now the subconscious mind and how we might be aware of what the potential holds. What exactly is the difference between our conscious mind and our subconscious mind?
Right. So, for example, when I'm sitting right now and I'm talking to you, there are different things which I'm doing consciously. I'm communicating with you, right? So I'm using certain parts of my brain which have to do with, calculation, so I'm thinking about what to say. At the same time, I'm talking about things which would be socially appropriate. So there's a certain part of the mind which controls that is conscious. At the same time, while I'm sitting over here, there are different things which are happening automatically. For example, my hand gesturing right now, that is communicated from a different part, which is conscious, but then it has an influence which is also subconscious. And still at the same time, while I'm sitting over here, I'll have an emotional reaction, which would be subconscious. I might get nervous, which again would be subconscious.
How is that being subconscious, getting nervous? Isn't that something very evident and something that you feel outrightly?
Right. So that's a very interesting question because, these things are working at parallel. So for example, when a person panics, initially there's an input which is at the conscious level, right? It could be a threatening situation.
Yeah.
And that is why the person would become nervous or would panic. Now, at the same time, that would influence the brain in a way that certain neurotransmitters, certain chemicals get released, certain hormones get released, which increase the heart rate, which would make a person short of breath. Now, there is another part of the brain, we call it amygdala, the lizard brain, which actually takes input from inside the body, right? Now, that part of the brain right now would be thinking that if the heart rate is higher, if I'm not breathing properly, then there has to be something wrong. So it actually then potentiates further into the chemicals which are activated by stress.
Okay, so Dr. Ali, something very interesting you mentioned was how the mind can even control physical manifestations.
Absolutely.
And that really reflects the power of the mind. Can we train the mind to think in a certain way so that we see positive manifestations?
Right. So what we can definitely do as a starting point would be to be more aware of the signaling inside the brain and how it's affecting the rest of the body. So for example, when we talk about the manifestations of a panic attack and the heart rate being higher, now if that person consciously makes an effort to breathe in a certain way, to take deep breaths, to hold the breaths, then the signaling, which is increasing the heart rate, they would get suppressed, right? So that is one way into which we can control certain actions which are under influence, like, by the environmental influence.
So you're talking about how a panic attack can be controlled. Anxiety can also be controlled in this regard?
Definitely. So like, you might have heard about mindfulness, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's a way in which we activate certain parts of the brain at a particular moment which have more to do with the sensory stimuli and the motor stimuli, and at the same time, the functioning of the brain which has to do more with past experiences, past traumatic experiences, painful experiences, that get suppressed. So we can modulate the functioning of the brain at a certain level to our advantage.
And if we tap into the suppressed aspects of our mind, do you think that our life becomes a more simpler, or we can understand it better? Because I'm trying to get to the point where we understand how we can control our thoughts and our feelings to get outcomes that match our expectations.
Right. So definitely there would be an influence of a positive attitude in terms of how we want to increase our functionality. Similarly, we can prioritize certain things which are important from us from a rational point of view, and learn to either not think about the others or find a way in which we endure them. And similarly, people have fears. For example, people have fear of heights or of spiders, right? And we know that there are different techniques through which they can be desensitized to that.
Which are those techniques? Because not everyone knows.
Right. So it's about exposure. It's exposure to the stimulus which gives you the most fear, which you're afraid of. And at the same time, you tell the person how to cope with that, how to control their bodily responses through exercises, through other agents which modulate certain chemicals in the brain. And when they do that, then they will be exposed to the same thing, but let's say the trigger for their anxiety or their fear, that would slowly start getting suppressed.
So doctor, what it sounds like is that if in ideally a controlled environment, we expose someone to their fear and we tell them how to react, they might be able to cope with their feelings.
Absolutely.
But what if the environment is not controlled? Because the whole purpose of getting understanding the mind is so that it can guide you through situations that are unexpected. Is that possible as well, to learn over time and how to deal with unexpected situations?
So there will when there's an element of surprise, it also depends on what sort of stimulus the surprise is attached to, right?
Okay.
I mean, if it's something which is rewarding, of course, our brain adapts to it in a much more positive manner. If it is something which is of punishing nature, then we develop an aversion against it. Now, if you see examples of it, for example, people who are exposed to trauma early in life, some of them, they take the trajectory of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
And the other ones, they take the trajectory of increased resilience. We call it post-traumatic growth. So it's all about how that particular, situation, when they encounter the stimulus, how they cope with it at that time. And in that aspect, then, the attitude, the social support, the mental health support and counseling, all of these play a major role.
And that's a very important point there, how a person can learn to cope with the situation. We'll definitely discuss that further, but before that, we'll take a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion of the power of the mind, we are now joined in the studios by Shawaz Baloch, who is the first visually impaired person in the world to receive a PMP certification. He has also received a presidential award for excellence. Thank you so much, Mr. Baloch, for joining us. Mr. Baloch, before we get into the whole topic and what the power of the mind in fact is, I'd like to hear your story.
Thank you very much for calling me on this occasion. My story revolves as I was listening to Dr. Saab, that he was talking about more sort of the emotional aspect of the mind and all that stuff. My story revolves around 3 fears of my life also. I was afraid of water, I was afraid of height, and I was afraid of darkness. And my first fear, my fear of water, and that was really difficult for me because I used to run away from even taking bath also. And that was a fear that I wanted to break. As a resilient in my nature, being a resilient person, I broke that fear and I became a very good swimmer. And then fear of height, if I talk about the fear of height, I was afraid of going on the heights also and all that stuff. And as a result, as a resilience in my nature, I became a pilot. And my third fear, that is the most important fear, and this fear is a friend of mine whom I'm with now. When I became a visually impaired, there was a darkness in my life. That was the fear of darkness. So in order to manage this fear, this was a really emotional decision for me, because for fear management, you have to first accept that fear, that okay, this has happened, now what we have to do now? We have to move ahead. Acceptability is really important in these situations. So I still remember when I became visually impaired, and I was there in the hospital, and when I opened my eyes, there was darkness everywhere. So at that moment, important thing was my power of decision. I accepted this in 5 minutes, that's all. Because I was knowing that I don't want to linger on and all that stuff. At some stage of my life, I have to accept this thing. This is reality. And then comes the second part, that is your management part. How you will be managing your fear. So these are the 3 fears which I have been managing throughout my life. And after that, I became a gold medalist. I won the gold medal in MS Project Management. Then I tested myself internationally. I became a PMP certified from PMI USA. And then I have got the certification from Prince to UK Axios. And then I've got the social entrepreneur from Oxford University, and web commerce from LUMS, Barrier University, gold medal, and all that stuff. So all these things related to the your, I think, emotional capital you have in yourself.
Mr. Baloch, everything that you've told us is extremely inspirational, and it's something that I think has anyone who hears your story would be in awe of it. But something that you mentioned here, and something I specifically want to ask you, is that your story reflects a very, very strong sense of resilience. Yeah. How do you manage with that? How do you make sure that your life is geared towards trying to adopt that principle at each and every turn?
So this is directly related to your psychological capital you have. I think if in your mind, if you have got these 4 or 5 qualities, that is if you are as a psychological capital, you have got the hope in your mind, then you have got the empathy, efficacy, then you have got the resilience, and then you are optimistic about yourself. These 3-4 things are really important for your psychological capital. If you have the psychological capital, then this is directly related to your emotional intelligence. Right? And then you are able to appreciate the situation, and then you are able to manage your fears and your problems and your failures at the same time.
And with that, I do want to ask Dr. Ali here, the psychological capital that Mr. Baloch here was mentioning, he is talking about how if you have this, you can manage with the given situation. But is there a way to adopt certain values within your system if you do not have them? For example, if a person does lack hope, how can they integrate that into their lives?
Right, that's a very, very critical question. And first of all, very, very inspirational story, sir. Right, so talking about the psychological capital and the way to inculcate all these, like, positive psychological elements in you. So first off, what needs to be assessed is if there is an underlying disease, if there's an underlying factor which is preventing that. You know, first of all, let's say like hope is something, it's a natural like emotion, you know, it should be there. It's a feeling, you know, which of course you can nurture, you can foster, but at the same time, this is something which is very instinctive to humans, to the mammalian brain, right? Because we all seek reward and we make efforts to do that. And when we do that, we also have an expectation and at the same time a hope. Now, if a person is hopeless, like a very likely cause of it could be an underlying, like, you know, neuropsychiatric pathology, for example, depression, right? So first of all these things need to be taken into consideration and, like, you know, addressed. But other than that, like, hope has a lot to do with the associations we form, right? So it's about looking at the glass and seeing if it's like half full or half empty, right? So if you make an effort about achieving something and you see that you have been able to achieve a little bit of it, you look at that thing as a rewarding element. So when you look at it as a rewarding element, you are also releasing chemicals in the brain which are making you more resilient and more hopeful. So it's about looking at small things and appreciating them.
So it's all about perspective here. And with that point, I'd also like to introduce another guest who has joined us, Professor Moiz Hussain, who is the Chief Executive at the Institute of Mind Sciences and the creator of the Fourth Dimension. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. So while we're talking about perspective here, something that I noticed your work talks about is the power of imagination. Can you tell us about that?
The human mind has two amazing abilities, and according to one of the research by a gentleman called Jose Silva in the early 40s, he found out that geniuses have two powerful faculties. One is visualization and one is imagination. If a person is able to visualize events that have passed, especially the ones that have been good for him or her, in colors, then that ability helps him to imagine much better. Now, imagination is a faculty which quite strangely sometimes has nothing to do with the past. For example, people have imagined things which never existed within the environment. Neither they've heard about it, neither they've seen it, nor they've touched it, felt it, smelled it. And yet they were able to imagine something which eventually over a period of time came into physical existence. So this faculty of the mind is responsible for all new development, new research, breakthroughs in science, medical science, and everything that we see around in our life, from a cell phone to a rocket to a satellite, everything is based on human imagination. A couple of years back, I remember when I was a child, we used to have a series called Star Trek on television. And in that Star Trek, they used to have something which at that time people didn't understand. And they thought this was all foolish, like a cell phone and a Twitter and a laptop. But then eventually what the human can conceive and believe it can achieve. This is the power of human imagination.
Wow. So, Professor Hussain, something that you're talking about is thinking and then bringing that thing into existence, into reality. And related to that, I have a question related to the law of attraction. And many books have been written on this. I want to ask about your take on it.
Okay, the law of attraction is a recent find, a couple of 4 to 5 years back ago. The Holy Quran talks about it 1400 years back ago. In one of the verses of the Holy Quran, Allah says that whatever you think, I'll give it to you. It's called Guman. The word is Guman. So if a person is able to think something persistently with feelings and faith, somehow he's able to materialize that. So that is the law of attraction. But there are certain requisites which are required for that law to work. A lot of people think most of the time, but they never get what they want or what they think. There are two elements which are required. Number one is faith in a higher reality, in things that happen in our life. And the second is feeling. If you have appropriate feeling as if what you want has already been achieved. Normally people tend to think in the future. When you think about something in the future, it always remains in the future. It never occurs. But if you tend to think that it is happening right now, you are using it, you are driving a car, you got the money, you got health, whatever it is, then somehow, because your brain cannot distinguish between real and unreal. For example, if you found of a particular kind of a food, and if you close your eyes and imagine that food is in front of you, think about the aroma, the taste, the color, you start getting gastric juices in your stomach, although the food is not present there. So the brain cannot distinguish whether you are imagining it or it's really there. Using that to our advantages, we create certain images in our mind of something that hasn't appeared, hasn't come or hasn't appeared. Yet we believe that it has already happened. The moment we start believing it has happened, it actually begins to happen. That is the law of attraction.
Okay, so that was a great explanation there, Professor. Something also that you've talked about in your work is how the brain should be geared towards a solution-oriented approach. What can you tell us about that?
See, first of all, we need to, as masses, we need to understand that we focus more on problems. The more you focus on problems, one of the principles of the mind is that whatever you focus on becomes larger, becomes bigger. So we focus on problems. All the time we're talking about problems. Because we talk about problems, the problems tend to increase. We never have been taught to think about solutions. So if you think about solution or the way out, then the solution will come to you easily. So one thing that we need to remember and understand, let's focus on solutions. Talk less about problems. We all have problems. Problems are a part of life. Every problem helps us to become more stronger, more better. Every failure leads us to more success. People need to understand this. So let's start focusing on solutions. How can I get rid of this? How can I achieve this? What is stopping me? What can I do? Some of these questions, if put forward to a mind, and if a person starts writing answers to these questions, the chances are he will find a solution.
Yes, and on that very important point, Professor Hussain, I also want to link this to Mr. Baloch's real life example. So throughout your life, do you think that you were focusing a solution-oriented approach? Were you focusing less on the problem and more towards how to get on with your life?
I think I'll start off with the philosophy of less or more, I think. I think, in my opinion, less philosophy, the word less is more powerful than more, because you see, less driving, more exercise, more walking, less words, more actions, and less anger and more laughter. So linking up to my story, when I just want to add up one experience. When I opened my eyes, there was, in the hospital, there was darkness everywhere. So at that moment, there was a battle going on between my mind and my heart, actually. My mind was saying that, showing me the reality, you are finished, everything is finished, you are no more, you have nothing to left in your life. But at the same moment, my heart was, with me, and he was saying that, you see, nothing has been finished, you have to show more willpower, you should be determined enough, we can overcome this fear, we can overcome this problem. At the end of the day, my heart won from my mind. And I came to the conclusion that when you are working with your mind, your heart is like a second to this, your mind, and it adds up to the energy to your mind. So I think after that, what I did was that I told you already that I took the decision in 5 minutes that, okay, so this thing has happened to me, now I have to move ahead, that's all. I don't have to vape and all that stuff and all that, because I could hear all that people who were around me, all relatives, they were vaping and all that stuff, but I was quite normal. Yeah. I said to myself, okay, now I have taken the decision, I will never give up, I have to move ahead. I will challenge myself, whatever I will do, I will never, never, ever give up. That's
an amazing ethic that you're talking about, Mr. Baloch. And with that, I want to take my next question back to Professor Hussain. So what Mr. Baloch was talking about was a distinction between the mind and the heart, separating what your brain is telling you, what you might be thinking is the more practical way of looking at something, but something that is very deep within your heart. Now, this can go in a negative way and in a positive way. How can we ensure that there is harmony between the two, so for positive outcomes to emerge?
First of all, let's understand, basically what we say as a heart is actually the mind. In Greek, the mind is also known as the soul. So what the gentleman was saying was something that was coming out of his mind, not the brain. The brain works on the basis of information, prior information, and processes information. So if you don't have something in your life, then the brain thinks about nothing in your life. So it gets depressed, it creates certain changes in the brain chemicals, and a person feels depressed. Now, to be able to understand how these two work, first of all, if a person is grateful. He lives his life with gratitude. It is the heart's way or the mind way. The more gratitude a person has in his life, the more he's able to balance between what he has and what he doesn't have. And it is the balance that is required. For example, a life in which relationships are given importance, more important than work, self-hygiene, self-assessment, self-realization, self-introspection, self-actualization also needs to be given due time. How many of us ever sit down for a few minutes a day with our eyes closed and think about how the day was passed and what have I done today and what was left to be done? We don't do that. We're too involved in what is going around us. So a bit of time to ourselves. One of my teachers used to say that it's important that you, for a few minutes every day, go and meet yourself. We never meet ourselves. We meet a lot of things. We meet people. We see television. We read newspaper. We see news. But how many of us really go and meet ourselves? So I think the balance that we're talking about is take out time and meet yourself.
Thank you so much, Professor Hussain, for taking out the time and talking to us. It was very insightful indeed. And now we are joined with Akshay Nanavati, who is an author of Farvana, and Dr. Steve Mc Learie, who is a psychiatrist. Thank you both for joining us. Akshay, I'd like to start off with you. Please tell us about how you overcame your obstacles to become who you are today.
Well, it's been a wild journey. I overcame drug addiction when I was in high school. I lost 2 friends to that lifestyle. Joined the military in the United States, got into the U.S. Marines, despite 2 doctors telling me that Marine Corps boot camp would kill me because of a blood disorder I was born with. Not only did I survive, but I thrived. Got out of Marine Corps boot camp. I got into mountain climbing, cave diving, ice diving. I spent a month skiing across an ice cap. When I came back from Iraq, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I struggled with depression and alcoholism that pushed me to the brink of suicide. And then I got out of that, and since then I've become an entrepreneur, an author, an ultra runner. I just ran my first 80-kilometer run a few days ago, and now I'm training for bigger and bigger runs as well while building my business. So overcome a few of those ups and downs in life to now be where I'm at.
Oh, that's amazing to hear. And while I was going through your site, Farvana, I read upon how it states that fear, stress, anxiety, struggle, adversity, and suffering can be transformed into the greatest of allies. What do you mean by that?
Through my experiences, through these highs and lows, I came to learn that we often demonize certain emotions and experiences. We say stress is bad, fear is bad, anxiety is bad. But the truth is that I came to learn that my symptoms of post-traumatic stress were not indicative of a disorder. So, for example, I was jumpy when there was a loud noise after the war, or I struggled with survivor's guilt. But that doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. These were very normal human responses to war. So post-traumatic stress was a normal human response. Same thing with fear. If I'm standing on the edge of a cliff and I feel fear, it's a normal human response. So however it shows up, the reality is there are no bad or good emotions. There are only emotions, and we can do anything we choose with them. And similarly, there are no bad or good experiences. There are only experiences. And we can choose how we make those experiences work for us. And my greatest things I've done in my life have been incredibly terrifying. They've been challenging. They've been filled with adversity. But they're the things I'm most proud of, including writing a book. It was incredibly challenging. It was filled with fear, ironically, because I was writing on fear. But it was the best thing I've ever done.
And Akshay, I'd like to talk more about your experiences, but before that, I'd like Dr. Steve's perspective on this. So what Akshay is talking about are emotions and how they, of course, exist, and it depends on us on how we take it. But of course, negative emotions, it's very difficult to reconcile with them. How can we turn them into positive emotions, if there is a way to do so?
So that's a very good question, very interesting question. So we know that everyone gets down at times, everyone becomes stressed at times. Sometimes that can evolve into a more clinical condition, like clinical depression. The distinction with clinical depression, for example, is often that there are more biological functions affected, like sleep, appetite, energy, those more what we call melancholic symptoms. What we also know is that how we think affects how we feel, and how we feel affects how we think. There's what we call cognitive loop between those 2 areas. So what we know and what the evidence base says is really helpful is firstly the foundations, the key foundations. So things like healthy eating, regular exercise can be very helpful, and there's a good evidence base for both of those, particularly regular exercise. a good sleep hygiene, a good sleep routine, going to bed around the same time every evening, trying to get 7, 8, even more hours of sleep per night, that repetitively, making sure that we're refreshed the next day. And then lastly, in general, structure, routine, predictability in our day-to-day lives can be really helpful. The second area that can be really important is talking and externalizing how we feel. Any worries and stresses that we have can be really helpful. A family member, a colleague, friend, that idea that a problem shared is a problem halved, I think is a very good maxim.
Dr. Steve, something here you mentioned was related to predictability, and in relation to that, I want to ask you, if a person has a negative outlook towards in their life and all they can predict is bad outcomes, doesn't predictability become counterproductive in this case?
So there's what we call cognitive predictability and behavioral predictability.
Okay.
So behaviorally, having predictability and a degree of control over how your day, for example, will develop can be really helpful. Cognitively, we talk about that idea of a glass half full or glass half empty cognitive style. And there's a therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, which can be really helpful for helping us to develop the strategies and the skills to help our thinking to become more positively focused.
Okay, I take your point there, and I want to take a question to Dr. Ali here. Is there a way to wire your mind? Something that many people wonder when they are down in the dumps.
Right, absolutely. So in the end, like, we are defined by the memories, we are defined by our experiences, right? If you've had a negative experience, you form a certain negative association with that particular scenario. If you failed an exam, then you think that every exam you'll take, like, you're apprehensive about it. You feel jittery, you feel that you're going to fail that. Now, the one thing is that, like, even imagining, even like having a good sleep and right before falling asleep, you imagine that you're not going to fail it. Communicating to yourself, looking at your resources, it helps you to change that pattern. Even reliving that in your imagination breaks that association.
So positive affirmation.
Exactly.
Okay.
You ask yourself these questions rationally, and then you think about that. You think about whether you have the resources to accomplish it. And if your answer is yes, then it sort of codes a positive association over there.
But over here, aren't we assuming that rationality is the default state? It could be irrational. A human mind is, of course, at many times irrational as well. So in that situation, what can a person do? Right.
So the one thing which I always like tell people is that, you have to stop judging yourself even for negative emotions and for negative predictability. I mean, these are human responses. And I always say that, they say that, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Also, what does kill you actually just makes you human, So it's okay to be sad about things. It's okay to be depressed about things, to be stressed about things. But then once that initial phase of the stress is over, you start looking at the things, without that cloud. You start looking at things in a matter of like, okay, do I want to keep the things like that, right? And if the answer is no, then gather all your resources, gather the courage. What are the things which are important for you? What are the things which you can learn to let go?
Okay.
And then you approach the things with a greater resilience, with a greater courage, and a positive mindset.
Okay. And with that, I want to take my question to Dr. Steve here. Dr. Steve, when we're talking about focusing on positive outcomes, how important is to declutter your mind of negative thoughts, of competing thoughts, of things that might be distractions?
That's super important, and we know that can be really helpful. And having strategies can be very helpful for that as well. So, for example, writing your thoughts down, keeping a thought diary or a thought record can be really helpful. And then to review that over time, to ask oneself, how much do I believe that negative thought, for example, do I believe it 100%, 70%, 50%? And to start to gradually challenge some of those more negative thoughts, to look at, as we said earlier, rationally, and to think, is there another way of thinking about these difficulties that might be more helpful? and we can gradually develop strategies and skills to think more positively over time. That can either be formally through cognitive behavioral therapy or formal therapies, or we can develop it as a community with our friends, with our families, in our employment. All of these can work really well and can be really helpful.
Okay, so on that point, I want to ask Akshay something that was very intriguing when I was going through his site once again, which was be positive is a destructive myth. So Akshay, were you trying to be provocative here, or do you actually believe that?
I genuinely believe that our overemphasis on being positive all the time can be very destructive. And there has been research that has shown that like we're just constantly being positive, we're covering up the darkness that is there, you know, and it's far more important to actually embrace the negative, as I like to say. Like with me, I still struggle with survivor's guilt. I embrace my demons. Like Carl Jung put it beautifully. He says, one does not become enlightened by imaging figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. We try to cover up all these things and whatnot, but the reality is let's embrace that there will be struggle in life. There will be darkness. There will be our demons. And instead of running away from it, let's engage those demons. So we talked about, Dr. Hussain talked about being still. That's a great way to engage your demons, to tap into that. I mean, today my demons are my allies. I have a picture of my friend I lost in the war, and it says, this should have been you. Earn this life. Yeah. So I use my demons. I'm not running away from the negative. I'm actually channeling the negative, channeling the darkness. And so I think being positive all the time is covering up what can be far more valuable to tap into that, to our own greatness ultimately.
And Akshay, from what I can tell, you do have a very optimistic approach, but what could you tell individuals who do not have the same line of thinking? How can they channel these negative emotions and think more positively?
Well, fundamentally, you recognize that you're not your thoughts, your feelings, or your experiences. You are the thinker of your thoughts, the feeler of your feelings, and the experiencer of your experiences. So there is a space between what shows up and who you can be outside of it.
Steve, with the same question, how would you take it?
So I think Akshay made a very good point. What we call mindfulness, those moments of stillness, thinking about thinking or thinking in a very open way can be really helpful to be reflective, but also to be in the moment, not constantly worrying, constantly thinking about the future, but just taking time out to be thoughtful, to be mindful, to be still can be really helpful.
And Dr. Steve, how can we exercise mindfulness?
So there are lots of very good strategies. One can find there's lots of apps, for example, available that support mindfulness. On a very simple level, it's about decluttering one's mind, taking time regularly, perhaps every day, just a few minutes, to focus on the here and now, to focus on, you know, something small. It may be a raisin, and just think about that for that moment, rather than constantly being under pressure to worry about what's going to happen in the future. Just to reflect, just to be still, just to be calm, and be in the moment. That's the central tenets of mindfulness.
And with that point, I'd like to move on to Mr. Baloch here. How important is visualization? Visualization in the sense of your goals and your dreams in order to move towards them, to constantly reinforce that that's something that's important to you?
I think that vision is extremely important in your life, because in my case, I have been, my sight was lost, but instead God has given me the vision. He has taken the shorter sight, but he has given me a longer vision. So I think starting from the vision, if you don't have the vision, then it means that you don't have the mission. And if you don't have the mission, it means that you don't have the strategy. And if you don't have the strategy, it means that you don't have the goal in your life. And if you don't have the goal, you don't have any tasks to do. And it means that your life is useless. And there will be no motivation in your life. There will be no willpower in your life. You will be isolated. You will be having negative thoughts in your life. So somebody said, and I quote, that you can have a dream, but a goal without a dream is just a dream. So you have to set your goals. And what does the goal stand for? Like in my definition of goal is go, G-O, aim your life. So this is the, I think, total philosophy of goal that you have. to set your goal, it should be smart enough. Smart means specific. The goal should be specific. It should be measurable. It should be achievable. It should be relevant to your objectives, and it should be time bound. It should be realistic. It should be in the time frame.
And
so I think this is the whole hierarchy.
Yeah, and that's a very, very interesting point you've made there. Dr. Steve, something that this discussion has brought up in very subtle ways is how community support is important when a person is dealing with trauma or negative emotions. Can you tell us about that? How important is that for an individual?
It can be super important. Often when we've experienced trauma, or we're feeling low, or we're feeling stressed, there can be a human tendency to maybe isolate ourselves a little bit, to stay at home more, not to be as much a part of the community. But we know that those connections, those supports can be really helpful, that individuals and communities are generally very caring and very supportive. And by talking, by being part of groups, by interacting, it can be really helpful and really supportive.
Yeah, and we're once again joined by Akshay. Thank you so much for rejoining us. We lost you there for a minute. Akshay, what is that one ethic you live by? Because your story is one of overcoming addiction, of becoming successful at what you do. But what's that one principle that guides you through it all?
The fundamental principle, I believe this is the most important skill to live a happier and more successful and meaningful life. It's to develop a positive relationship to struggle, a positive relationship to suffering. So however it shows up, that fear, that stress, that anxiety, that adversity, those hard, challenging experiences of life, when you actually develop a positive relationship to that, nothing will stand in your way. Because when life throws curveballs at your way, when it does that, you will be able to smile in the face of that suffering. So I actually turned it into a two-word ethos that I like to say, which is suffer well. So if you can suffer well, nothing can stop you. Whether it's life punching you in the face or whether it's you seeking out a goal, challenges will happen. And if you can suffer well, it won't matter. You'll actually embrace and move through those challenges.
That's a very positive note that you have given us. And with that, Dr. Ali, how do you think that we can, the mind can change in terms of its plasticity we mentioned earlier? How do you think it can change to embrace certain things, certain values that we did not have before?
Right. I mean, a key role is there of the environment and the community. So what we do know is, from animal research, from human research, that the biggest antidepressant or anxiolytic is the enriching environment. So if you get a positive feedback externally, it is very, very helpful. So there's actually a saying by Hafiz of Shiraz that I wish I could show you the astonishing light of your own being when you see only darkness around yourself. So what we need to focus on is that the person who's suffering, their perspective is that could be completely dark. But then you have to make them feel wanted. You have to contribute. You have to give them the positive feedback that they still carry the light, that they are very inspirational to the others. And that's a way in which the perspective changes and the modulation changes. Now, we talked about the plasticity of the brain. There's certain periods of life in which the brain is very plastic, very dynamic, very malleable to environmental experiences. One is early childhood, and even like in utero during the embryonic development. So a lot of these things, should be coming from the parents, should be coming from the schools where the kids go to. And that's where this positive attitude, and then that's where this resilience, that's where it all starts from. So I think there needs to be a lot of focus on that. Okay. Now, if this is happening in adulthood, what stimulates, the growth of neurons in the brain is actually seeking novelty. So if you go to a new place, if you start explorations, if you start getting all different kinds of sensory stimuli, all different kinds of inspiration, that can be very helpful. That actually stimulates new neurons. Now, these new neurons which are being formed, they have not been exposed to the previous traumatic experience.
Okay.
And that's why you can modulate them through your next positive experiences. That's
a great point there. And something that you mentioned was inspiration. And with that, I do want to take my next question to Mr. Baloch. How you are an immensely inspirational figure. How do you inspire those around you? How do you pass on the message of hope to them?
I think for me, what I have learned from this experience, for me, the total summary of my whole life is living for others, bringing smile on the face of others. This give me motivation from inside, give me energy into me, and gives me hope that okay, I have being a person as an entity in this society, I have to do something for others also. I have come into this world, the life is given once. Okay, as being a selfish human being, I have done the capacity building, I have done this certification, but what I have done for others. So when this question came into my mind, this was the whole trophy for me, and this was the whole lesson of my life. And I thought that I think this is it. This gives me a goal for every day. I do different type of social projects and charity projects in the domain of poverty alleviation, in the health and education and sports also, and all that stuff. So this thing is a life and a light for me at the end of the day. Okay, I'm sitting here at my alone, thinking about myself, that what I have achieved for the day.
Mr. Baloch, since we're running short on time, I take your point there, and it is a great message. But with that, I'd also like to move on to Akshay. Akshay, do you think that if a person struggles in the right direction, if they work hard enough, it's inevitable that they move towards their goals and they achieve their goals?
I mean, the harsh truth of life is that sometimes life is indifferent. You could be in a really bad position in the world. I've seen people in intense circumstances of suffering that work incredibly hard, and the harsh truth is just the nature of the external circumstances. They're probably not going to get out of that world, right? So do I believe in hard work? Of course. There are elements of how the environment shapes us, where you're born, and I guess luck, if you want, whatever you want to call it, the universe, luck, you know, the divine, however you want to call it. But so I think it's a combination of work hard and work smart. But fundamentally, I mean, it boils down to what I was saying earlier. Ultimately, grit and resilience, you know, you can call it resilience, grit, the ability to suffer well, however you want to put it. That's going to guide you through life no matter what external circumstances throw your way. Yeah. So that is ultimately essential.
Okay, thank you for that comment. And very quickly to you, Dr. Steve, on that same point, do you think that people can, if they work hard enough, they can become more positive? Of course, external circumstances are there, but do you think that there is a way out of adversity?
Absolutely, 100%. And I guess as a doctor, as a physician, I see that all the time. I see people all the time who do really well, partly through hard work, but also having all of those basic tenets we spoke about earlier, and sometimes with more structured therapies. Sometimes therapies can be very helpful as well.
Thank you so much for that last comment. Thank you so much, Dr. Steve, for joining us. Thank you so much, Akshay, for joining us. Mr. Baloch, Dr. Ali, it was great talking to all of you. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We hope to see you again tomorrow. Goodbye.